He looked straight into the camera and said it without flinching. Mentally, I'm not okay. How did it come to this? How did Lewis Hamilton, a 7-time world champion, end up eliminated in Q2 again? This is not just a bad Saturday. This is a deep, technical, and mental unraveling inside Ferrari that we are going to unpack minute by minute. Because what happened in Interlagos was more than a lap time. It revealed everything that's broken inside the red machine. He had just climbed out of the car. The helmet still in hand, the visor slightly fogged. Reporters crowded around, lights flashing, microphones pushed forward. And then, without hesitation, Lewis Hamilton delivered the sentence that froze the paddock. Mentally, I'm not okay. No anger, no theatrics, just the voice of a man worn down by a season that promised dreams and delivered doubts. It was not just about qualifying anymore. It was about identity, belief, and purpose. We are not talking about a rookie thrown into chaos. We are talking about one of the most complete drivers this sport has ever seen. A man who dominated the hybrid era, redefined what consistency under pressure looks like, and pushed an entire team like Mercedes to unprecedented heights. For a competitor of that caliber to be knocked out of Q2 twice in a single weekend, at a circuit he once mastered, is not just a blip, it is a collapse. The Interlagos weekend was always going to be intense. The sprint format compresses time, punishes errors, and exposes any weakness. But few expected Hamilton to be stranded in 13th place on the Sunday grid, having failed to make the top 10 cut. Twice. Once in the sprint shootout, and again in the main qualifying session. The track did not change. The man did not change. So what did? The answer points not to Hamilton, but to the very machine Ferrari has given him. His SF25 simply would not respond. It refused to fire up the rear tires, refused to maintain grip through key traction zones, and left Hamilton wrestling a car that felt more like a puzzle than a tool. It is a painful irony, the most adaptive driver of the modern era being held back not by age, not by form, but by engineering decisions outside his control. In conditions where confidence is king, the red car gave him none. What made it even more brutal was the glimpse of what could have been. In the sprint race earlier that day, Hamilton had gained 3 places off the start and finished 7th. It was a masterclass in racercraft, overtaking with precision and extracting every inch of potential. For a moment, it looked like momentum was shifting, that something in the setup had clicked. But when qualifying resumed a few hours later, all that hope dissolved. The tire temperatures plummeted again. The grip vanished, and with it, the chance to fight up front. The qualifying session on Saturday was not a surprise. It was a confirmation, a painful one, because Ferrari knew they had problems coming into Brazil. The signs were already there during the sprint qualifying on Friday. The car struggled with balance, traction, and rear-end stability, the same symptoms that have haunted the SF25 since pre-season testing. But when you see Lewis Hamilton, a man who has built his legacy on out-qualifying the best under pressure, get knocked out in Q2 without any major incident, you realize this is not about bad luck. This is structural failure in slow motion. Let us be clear. 13th on the grid is not just a bad starting position. It is symbolic of a team drifting. A car fundamentally out of sync with what its driver needs. Hamilton's radio feedback was sharp and precise. The tires never reached operating window. The balance shifted corner to corner. The rear axle felt disconnected under load. And yet, the setup was not radically different from Leclerc's. The problem was not individual adaptation. It was systemic. A car unable to generate or retain rear tire temperature in a circuit like Interlagos, which demands stable traction on elevation changes and short braking zones. In the first segment of qualifying, Hamilton advanced without much drama. But even then, the car looked loose. The rear end stepped out in turn 4, oversteer into turn 10. And more tellingly, an aggressive steering correction entering Junção corner that every driver knows requires rhythm, not fight. By Q2, the margin for error vanished. The conditions remained dry, but cool. Cloud cover settled. Track evolution slowed. Hamilton's first flying lap was nearly 0.3 off Leclerc's, not because of a mistake, but because the tires were not generating bite. This is where Ferrari's weekend began to unravel. They had spent the only practice session of the weekend running hard compound tires, focusing on long-run data and saving softs for later. That might work on paper. But in the real world, when you only have 60 minutes to collect thermal and mechanical feedback under sprint regulations, that strategy becomes high risk. Hamilton entered qualifying without a clear map of how the C4 compound would behave under push lap stress. And when the car failed to adapt, there were no baselines to recalibrate. Even more concerning was the team's apparent surprise. The engineers expected the SF-25 to perform better. That alone raises alarm bells. In a sport where precision data, simulation accuracy, and predictive modeling are fundamental, how does a team like Ferrari misjudge the car's competitiveness this badly? When a driver of Hamilton's caliber says, "The team thought we were a lot faster than we are," it is not criticism, it is a cry for alignment. He did his job. The machine did not. And Ferrari's tools, the wind tunnel, the simulation metrics, the compound modeling were not in harmony with reality. So what now? Because if a driver as experienced and technically articulate as Lewis cannot extract performance on a Saturday, then Sunday becomes survival. And survival is not what Hamilton signed up for when he put on the red suit. To understand the collapse of performance in Hamilton's Q2 session, you need to start with a single variable, tire temperature. Not grip, not balance, temperature. Because in modern Formula One, the window of peak performance for a tire compound is brutally narrow, sometimes as little as 10 degrees Celsius, and if your chassis cannot reach that threshold in the right sequence of corners, the entire lap disintegrates. That is exactly what happened to the SF-25. The rear axle was underworked, the surface temperature stayed low, and the chemical adhesion never activated. Hamilton was not sliding because he overdrove. He was sliding because the tires were cold. Ferrari's design philosophy for 2025 put a heavy emphasis on aerodynamic downforce generated through ground effect. That is not unusual. Most teams followed that path under the current FIA regulations. But where Ferrari went aggressive was in how much they sacrificed mechanical compliance. The SF-25 features a very stiff rear suspension geometry designed to keep the underbody flow consistent at high speed. The problem? That same stiffness prevents the tires from receiving the micro-load variations that generate heat through sidewall flex and deformation. So unless the driver is cornering at maximum load constantly, the rear wheels stay too cold. In Interlagos, this architectural flaw became unmanageable. Sector 2 of the Brazilian circuit is a mix of medium-speed changes of direction with gradient, exactly the kind of layout that demands confidence on throttle application. But if the rear tires have not reached temperature after Sector 1, by the time the driver enters the twisty middle sector, every correction at the wheel bleeds energy. And instead of building heat, the car begins a vicious cycle of sliding, oversteer, and time loss. That is what Hamilton fought lap after lap. The issue was compounded by ambient and track conditions. Saturday afternoon brought overcast skies, slightly lower asphalt temperatures, and a reduced rubberden surface compared to the morning sprint race. These are exactly the conditions that require precise thermal tuning, aggressive outlaps, carefully timed preparation, and possibly even asymmetric brake bias strategies to push more energy into the rear axle. And yet, Ferrari appeared caught off guard. Their baseline tire prep routine was conservative. Hamilton exited the pit lane with minimal lateral scrub and never had the thermal delta needed to wake up the rears. What makes this failure more damning is that it was predictable. This is not a one-off malfunction. Ferrari has suffered similar tire warm-up issues throughout the season. Zandvoort, Suzuka, even in Bahrain's cooler FP sessions. Both Hamilton and Leclerc reported it early on, but Interlagos exposed just how little had been resolved. The lack of response in Q2 was not due to weather. It was the car's intrinsic inability to generate energy through its suspension. Hamilton's feedback, lap traces, and post-session comments all point to the same core, a chassis that looks fast in simulations but fails in physics. And so, as the session ended and Hamilton parked 13th on the sheet, the reality set in. He had executed a flawless outlap, picked the right lines, and stayed within margins. But the car simply did not deliver the tools he needed. When a Formula One car fails to bring its tires into the window, it becomes undrivable at the limit no matter who is behind the wheel. And in Brazil, even a 7-time world champion could not bend the laws of thermodynamics. Once the session was over, once the engineers had seen the telemetry, and once the microphones returned to Hamilton, there was no sugarcoating left. He stood still, calm but firm, and said what no Ferrari driver should have to say. The team thought we were a lot faster than we are. That sentence landed like a brick. Because in Formula One, expectation mismanagement is not just an error, it is a structural fault. When your development team, your race engineers, your simulation tools all feed you data that says the car is competitive, and reality proves the opposite, you are not simply underperforming. You are misaligned with truth. The consequences of such a disconnect are enormous. Ferrari had entered the Brazilian weekend with optimism. Internal targets suggested a top 6 qualifying result. They had even modeled high tire retention across race simulations. But when both cars struggled in sprint qualifying, and Hamilton was once again eliminated in Q2 just 24 hours later, those models were exposed as fiction. It was not a marginal miss. It was a fundamental breakdown in understanding how the SF-25 behaves under real-world pressure in real-world conditions. Hamilton's frustration did not come from ego. It came from effort. He had delivered clean laps. He had adjusted his outlaps to match rear axle prep. He had followed every instruction. And still, the car refused to respond. His comments after qualifying were not emotional bursts. They were surgical diagnoses. Everything is done in the garage. That phrase speaks volumes. It points the finger not at strategy calls or driver execution, but at the preparation phase, at the way Ferrari configures the chassis before a single wheel turns.